So good morning, everybody, and welcome to this open session with Shannon Jackson. My name is Christina. I'm the PARSE professor at the Academy of Music and Drama, and I have coordinated this jam that follows from this open session together with Shannon, and also understood pleased to be sitting here for those of you who weren't here before for the introduction. We will get started in just a minute. I just want to introduce and welcome Shannon Jackson to Gothenburg for the third time this year. I'm delighted that you're here today, and that you were able to get in last night and had no problems with roads being closed and so on. So Shannon Jackson is the Associate Vice Chancellor for Arts and Design at UC Berkeley, University of California, Berkeley. She is also a professor there in Rhetoric and Performance Studies. And Shannon is a very influential scholar in the field of performance studies with several books to her name. She is the recipient of numerous awards and has really done a lot for research across the arts. She's also my former dissertation advisor, so I'm a little bit biased. She also was the founder in 2006 of the Berkeley Arts Research Center, is no longer the director, but still working a lot with programming and that. So I think I'm just going to turn it over to you. We're so delighted that you're here, and I'm very much looking forward to this talk. We'll entitle Vocabularies of Assembly, Assembling Vocabulary. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you, Christina. It is so wonderful to be at this university and to be part of the PARSE consortium, and to be anticipating all of the different cross-disciplinary artistic experiments going on today and that this university has ahead of it. So I think that Christina has given a number of introductions now that set me up. And I'll reinforce a little bit about what she said and then move on and try to also learn a little bit about you all here, who has assembled here. So basically, yes, I'm trying to think about vocabulary and think about vocabulary as an access issue, as an issue around inclusion and exclusion, about who speaks about what, especially in contexts that join art makers, curators, and scholars, and where there can be issues around vocabulary there, as well as some broader social and political issues animated by a great deal of conversation at UC Berkeley right now about who is included and excluded, about what it is to speak about inclusion and exclusion, even at our university. In general, I think of myself as a scholar who works in two major buckets. One, I think a lot about inter-art conversation across the visual arts, across the performing arts, and across media arts. This is a fairly recent book that works in that mode. And then secondly, related but sort of second, I think of myself as someone who works on arts and social change, or arts and social justice, considering the role of the arts in addressing political and economic and global issues, as well as the role of the arts in maintaining social equality. So some previous work and some newer works in that mode as well. So inter-arts, arts and social justice. These two domains can overlap, and to me it's most interesting when they do overlap. And I've often found in past work that sometimes the turn to another art form, the decision to cross disciplinary art forms, is often motivated by some kind of social or public or political enterprise. And of course, sometimes those turns, sometimes a turn to performance or the turn to the social, also can be social in a sort of banal or evacuated or neutralized sense. There can be all kinds of meditations and rethinkings about how a turn to performance or to participation can also be used to activate not so much social and political activism, but you could say the social scene of the art world, or where, as to invoke one of the other strains in this circuit today, where the turn to participation actually is motored by a principle of exclusion rather than inclusion. And I'll say a little bit about that, this other strain, in later parts of my remarks. As Christina mentioned, and a lot of what I have been doing at UC Berkeley, whether at Arts Research Center or other places, is to create different kind of public fora that gather arts administrators, curators, artists, and scholars from the Bay Area and globally into conversations around issues or topics of concern to them. And it was in that context, in the attempt to bring performing arts, visual arts, media arts, filmmakers, choreographers into the same space, that we began to worry and confront issues around vocabulary. We started to realize that people might come in with using the same word, say the word performance or the word composition, and they might have radically different ideas about what they meant by that word. As Christina mentioned, it turned out that another U.S. nonprofit foundation, the Pew Center for Arts and Heritage, was also really concerned about vocabulary. This is an arts organization that makes grants to different artists to make grants in visual art exhibitions, in theater, in dance, in music. And they started to realize that the program officers of these different grant bodies had no idea how to talk to each other, or that they had very different ideas about what made a strong work, about what innovation in the arts, in their respective art fields were. Meanwhile, they were also receiving proposals that were incredibly interdisciplinary, that didn't fit neatly in dance, that they could have traveled across dance or across exhibition or across music, that they didn't fit into neat categories. So it was with that, these two contexts, Pew Center and Berkeley, that we ended up starting to work on the site that Christina mentioned, focusing on this word performance, but also thinking about a whole range of, and this gives you just a sense of what it is to work on this site, a whole range of keywords that are related in some way to performance and contemporary art. But our effort was to commission different artists, curators, and critics to do meditations and reflections about each of these keywords. So, for instance, if you have performativity, a word that circulates a great deal in social theory and in contemporary art, and you think about what Judith Butler, a critic who I'm assuming most people know, my colleague at Berkeley, whose work has activated the use of this term, what she has to say versus what Malik Gaze has to say, versus what Emily Royston has to say, turn out to create this sort of textured conversation where we don't have one perfect, we're not trying to force one viewpoint or one encyclopedic understanding of what what the word means, but to create a conversation across different positions. So I'm going to even just try to get, this is a pretty rigid seating area, and I'm very aware of it. I'm just going to try to get even a sense from you all. When I invoke this word performance, understanding that I'm invoking an English word now and asking you to think about this word as it circulates in the international English context, what association comes forward for you when you hear this word performance, or associations?
Live art.
Live art, okay. Both the word live as well as the word art, and but we might even think about what the word live means on its own, and then what it means to join it with the word art. What are some other associations?
Space.
Space. Interesting. So why does it mean space to you?
Because it's live art and you sort of activate the space.
That it feels like that there's something about performance that is also a spatial gesture, that is also about a kind of invitation to become aware of the space.
It starts moving the space, starts moving in the space.
Yeah. Wonderful.
The energies.
Yes, moving the energies around, right? Okay, great. Other associations? Yes.
Time.
Time. So there's a durational,
Time-based.
time-based, right? Yeah. So there's a sense of duration, a sense of, as somebody coming from the performing arts, from the music and drama end of things, I don't think I realized I was in a time-based art form until visual art people started to tell me that I was in a time-based form. And it was only at that moment that I started to think, oh wow, time. Yeah, it was so naturalized for me. Duration was so naturalized for me that I almost didn't even see it anymore. Okay, yes? Audience. Yeah, there's something about performance that seems to need an audience in order to be itself. Yes?
Body.
Body. So we can decide, is body related to live or not related to live? Liveness, sometimes we talk about on the news, we're coming to you live on television, but that's not an embodied form. That's a mode of liveness that is not embodied versus you're bringing in, yes, the necessity of it being embodied, like we are right now, even if we're sort of ignoring our embodiedness to some degree sitting in those chairs. Other things, yeah? Transience. So it doesn't stay. That's a whole lot of controversial and volatile and productive theory around performance has been about the fact that it doesn't stay around, that it is about disappearing, that it is ephemeral, right? Okay, great. Any last associations? Yeah. Meeting. Oh, so that it feels like about meeting fellow people, gathering, encounter. So a sense of ensemble, a sense of, I'll also use the word relational, but we could also say it invokes, and there's reasons that performance and participation sometimes get alive. Okay, great. So all of those are, to me, incredibly resonant associations. They are not the same associations, though. They are they're evoking different ideas, different senses of connection to this word performance. And so that you might even find that when you're in a discussion where that vocabulary word performance is used, somebody might be coming in there because they're so interested in space, and somebody else might be coming in because they're so interested in time. And some might be coming in because they really care about bodies, and some really might not. So just to even foreground why this term, along with many other terms, are important to us, I think it's useful to surface that difference right from the beginning. Many of you might know that the word performance comes from a Latin root meaning to furnish forth, to carry out, to bring into being. So I think that's also useful to be have in our sense of vocabulary. In the U.S. and in English context, you'll often hear the word performance being used to describe evaluation. In a work context, you'll get your performance evaluation. So it's also about your effectiveness, your productivity, what you're furnishing forth, and a word that gets circulated in late capitalism for those reasons as well. I even started in a totally amateur way to try to think, because I don't speak Swedish, try to even think, and you guys can correct me, of what different types of synonyms might or might not be relevant in a Swedish context for synonyms for performance. And even there, it's sort of interesting how execution versus the display, that there's different associations even in this very amateur reflection. I was told that there are people gathered, that there was an effort here to make our conference accessible to Farsi speakers, and I even again, with the help of one of my grad students, also even started to try to think about how these keywords might function in different languages. It's not going to be the focus of my talk, but part of even bringing this site to an international context also forces an awareness of how keywords in different languages might work as well. So, as I said, this is part of the experience of this site, and as we go through and as one starts to think about the curation of vocabulary from different perspectives, once again, the meditation from an experimental playwright like Mac Wellman versus a curator currently at the Contemporary Jewish Museum in New York like Jens Hoffman, all of these different associations come forward depending upon the professional position and the artistic position and sometimes the political position of different keyword meditators. One of the things that I began to feel, however, is that there's something about the keyword meditation that is accessible. You all just even started to meditate about keywords, that there is something that scholars might be particularly verbal people, but that there's something about the keyword reflection that creates a broader invitation, so that people from different positions can meditate and contribute. Emily Royston and Ralph Lemon, choreographer, both ended up creating a kind of exercise and prompt, almost a score, as part of their contribution, whereas others do something semi-encyclopedic. Here's Stefan Kegi, who is an artist with Rimini Protocol, used the chance to also think about Rimini Protocol's own work next to artists who also work in the mode of reenactment. All right, so that's a bit about what I would call the sort of inter-arts conversation, around vocabulary and inclusion. But I also did want to invoke here and think a bit more about another dimension of my research into keywords, which actually invokes another keyword in my title, this word assembly. Currently, as I said earlier, a lot of my work around arts and social justice is indebted to and motored by my teaching and my convening at UC Berkeley, specifically at a public university whose commitment to public access is threatened with public defunding. This is a US issue that is making its way to Europe as well. Our university's activist legacies, many of you may know that it is the historic site of the free speech movement in the United States. Our activist legacies were faced with new challenges, especially in this last year as alt-right conservative speakers have been seeking to appropriate the legacies of free speech and taking over our campus. My colleagues and I have already been working, I don't know if you've heard about this, I'm happy to talk more, but also kind of don't. But my colleagues and I have already been working on creating different kinds of assembly, different kinds of public assembly around the key word public assembly, where we're really trying to think about this word assembly and about how at this political time we might convene and gather different forms of assembly. So we had already been working actually on a gathering where we invited artists, designers, critics, and theorists around to meditate with us about public reassembly across creative forms, across new technologies, all with social justice issues in mind. And as the year started to ramp up, we found it even more necessary and precious to have gathering spaces like this in order to find a place to reassemble ourselves and a place for our own social repair. So I'm going to think a little bit more about this as a keyword, assembly, in my remarks now. What does it mean to assemble in public? This is a huge issue, I think, for me. And the second question I often have that for me is also equally interesting is, what does it mean to assemble public systems? Is there any relation between the appearance of the former and the operations of the latter? So to take up the first question about the present meaning of, say, assembling in public is, of course, to invoke a long history of reflection about the public sphere, and especially about the physical appearance and arrangement of bodies in real time and co-present public space. Within social theory, to assemble in public is to recall both the embrace and the condemnation of this appearance. Embraced, you could say, as a key element of a so-called democratic process, and condemned also as an unruly takeover by the masses. In her book, recent book, Notes Toward a Performative Theory of Assembly, my colleague Judith Butler recalls the ambivalence amongst thinkers of all political persuasions about whether and how such assemblies index the people, and whether they index a populism to be celebrated or a populism to be castigated. So the people as a figure and assembly as a figure has everything to do with what is included or excluded. Butler cites Ernesto Laclau and Chantal Mouffe to reinforce her argument that any appeal to the people as such depends upon a constitutive exclusion of who is not recognized within the assembly and who is rightly or wrongly represented by said assembly. So too, attributions of democracy, I'm going back and forth here, or the democratic power of any gathering shift depending upon one's tacit alignment with the principles and symbols of the gathering. What looks like brainwashed populism from one vantage point might be heralded as democracy in action from another vantage point. For Butler then, assembly is performative by virtue of its power as an act of delimitation, an act of both exclusion and inclusion. This is the performativity of assembly in, you could say, the Austinian sense, in the speech act theory sense, where she says, the performativity of assembly, quote, establishes a fundamental problem of democracy even as, or precisely when, it furnishes, performance furnishes, its key term, the people, end quote. Like an Austinian speech act that does things with words, Butler highlights the world-making power of assembly to produce a people that it simultaneously appears to describe and which it can never fully include. But, she also says, assemblies are performative in other ways that not only invoke the rhetorical sense of the performative, which wasn't necessarily an association that came forward when I did my word sourcing here, but also the medium-specific sense of performance. What do I mean by that? I mean more what you all were talking about, the medium-specific sense of performance as a place that to think about space, about bodies, about time, about liveness. That medium-specific sense of performance is also of interest to her in this book, where she starts to think about emphasizing the physicality of assembly, the appearance of bodies in real time and space, with roles assigned and assumed, sometimes with appropriate infrastructure for managing safety, crowd flow, sight lines, and its durational unfolding. In my past work, I've often been very deeply interested in the relationship between performance and socially engaged art, and in particular, this sort of infrastructural sense of performance. Notably, Butler brings this orientation to bear on her understanding of what it means to assemble in public, or what she refers to as what it means to take seriously the physicality of concerted bodily enactment. She calls this a plural form of performativity. Assemblies are performative then because they are discursive, because they furnish this rhetorical, discursive, linguistic effect in terms of how they establish the people. And assemblies are also performative in a physical sense because of the way that they foreground the precarious potency of bodily enactment. And here I'll share one longer quote about this dialectic. After all, says Butler, there is an indexical force of the body that arrives with other bodies in a zone visible to media coverage. That's an issue. It is this body and these bodies that require employment, shelter, healthcare, and food, as well as a sense of a future that is not the future of unpayable debt. It is this body or these bodies or bodies like this body or these bodies that live the condition of an imperiled livelihood, decimated infrastructure, accelerating precarity. So I routed us through Butler's thinking just for a bit because it sets off to me and activates a long-term interest I have about the creation of a kind of infrastructural aesthetics appropriate to the social conditions of infrastructural life. But I also did this because it's a way of answering one of my opening questions about whether there is a connection between assembling in public and the assembly of public sector systems. And here, Butler is suggesting that there is a relationship between the appearance of assembly in public and our awareness of the need for public sector systems. When she says, when she says that the bodily assembly in public, in fact, provokes awareness of the need for public sector systems, for the need to have access to provisions that sustain the lives of those bodies. The immediately physical appearance in her mind signals the dependence, our collective dependence upon social systems and our need for access to them. So this is sort of really exciting to me, that possibility that performance and a performance assembly might also produce this systemic consciousness. But at the same time, I'm often asking, is it always true that bodily assembly provokes awareness in fellow citizens about everyone's need for access to healthcare, employment, shelter, food, and free education? Does it always? Does it for some and not for others? Indeed, for some, is not the arrival of bodily assembly greeted with shock and sometimes disdain or even disgust, and sometimes, at the very least, annoyed? Does this protest movement really have to block my way as I'm trying to get to work after I have employment, or get there in the way of my attempt to get to the grocery store, my access to food? For some, public assembly in the street is often inconvenient for the privileged citizen, interrupting her own ease of access to provisions, an ease of access that has become so naturalized she might not even be aware of her systemic privilege. So while I want this to be right, I also have some war wounds and concerns about whether or not it always works. But I'll stay committed to maintaining the hope that we can find formats of assembly and create moments when, indeed, assemblies in public advance the goal of public sector reassembly. And so I'll have that pursuit in mind as I continue. So in the rest of my time, I actually want to go a little deeper into a few more associations attached to this word assembly, and I'll go through this is only 4 of them. As somebody who's thinking about assembly quite a bit, I could have given you 8 or 9, but I'll focus on 4 to see what we might glean for connecting it to other dimensions of this conference. So, first of all, assembly as primarily a gathering of persons for the purpose of deliberation and decision making. Here, of course, is the definition most associated with the long tradition of democratic social theory in which my and Butler's earlier reflections are embedded. Butler is interested to foreground a presumed physicality to the gathering and its persons, not only the content of exchange, but for my purposes, that dialectic between physical and linguistic performativity is important, as well as the relationship amongst some of these words, gathering, deliberation, and decision. The middle term, deliberation, of course, connects assembly to the goals of the public sphere, as Habermas and his critics have elaborated it. It suggests the assembled gathering is indeed a place to share perspectives, to share disagreements, and to reconcile the aspirations and demands of varied citizens and constituents. Decision, however, that word decision takes us elsewhere, certainly when within the context of democratic governance. In such a context, decision might imply the institution of a new process, a new law, a new regulation. And so once again, this is where we find an interesting dialectic between the act of assembling in public and the act of assembling, and we could say implementing, public sector systems. For Butler, there's a recursive and transitory relationship between the physical assembly and you could say the decisions and power they have on something like government. In speaking about the Occupy movement or Arab Spring, she writes, such enactments, Occupy, Arab Spring, some of the other major moments of assembly in recent years, such enactments are invariably transitory, ephemeral, when they remain extra parliamentary, and when they realize new parliamentary forms, i.e. when a decision is made, they risk losing their character as the popular will. Further, as the popular will persists in the forms it institutes, it must fail to lose itself in those forms if it is to retain the right to withdraw its support from any political form that fails to maintain legitimacy. Unquote. So dissatisfaction with the law or governmental processes prompt the desire to assemble. That's why we're coming out. Which in turn might evolve new laws, new governmental processes, which in turn create new dissatisfactions, which might in turn prompt new acts of public assembly. However abstract, the effort here is to ensure that the popular will not lose itself in its instituted forms. What does that mean? To be losing oneself in instituted forms. When citizens worry about losing themselves in institutions, that concern is often read as a concern, I think, to avoid one's own bureaucratization, to ensure that the spirited expression of the people's will remains alive and lively against governmental regulation. And I understand and largely appreciate that interpretation. But I myself have also been equally interested in how the people's will might remain alive and lively in regulation. That is, in the forms they institute. When or how or if can people see themselves in their instituted forms, not only rejecting instituted forms? And is it possible for us, ourselves, as citizens, to see ourselves more? This really comes from my own sense, especially in the US, about a certain kind of anti-institutional rhetoric, anti-institutional language, being allied with the left and now appropriated by the conservative right that also wants to take down our social institutions. So that is largely the concern that I have about why or whether we can actually think about people's will in institutional forms. Of course, for me, this is also where the art comes in. Indeed, if I recast a lot of my preoccupations, I've always been interested in public art projects that have a chance of sensitizing citizens to public systems. So in past work, if anyone knows any of the past work, some of my favorite people who've worked in this mode include people like Merle Latterman Euclides, who moved from washing museums as a form of art practice to expose the labor that keeps the museum running, to becoming a semi-permanent artist in residence with New York's sanitation department, where she worked to foreground the labor that keeps the city running. Or as she said in this project, Touch Sanitation, she shook the hands of all 5,000 public sanitation workers in the 5 boroughs of New York, saying, "Thank you for keeping New York City alive." Or in this piece, Social Mirror, she put a mirror on the side of a garbage truck in order to ask citizens to see their own reflection, in their public sector systems here. She had a recent retrospective at the Queen's Museum, which was awesome and long overdue, in my opinion. Or I also have worked on another complicated project where Paul Chan, a visual artist, expanded his practice by citing a piece, Waiting for Godot in New Orleans right after Hurricane Katrina. Here, creating a site-specific and durational, a spatial intervention and a durational intervention as a kind of social practice project where the creation of this production required a kind of assembly of a range of the community organizations, hospitals, schools, in order to mobilize a different kind of support system in post-hurricane, post-Katrina New Orleans. In some ways creating and joining the theatrical assembly of putting on a play inside of a site-specific scene, and turning it into a wider context of public reassembly in order to rethink and reimagine the future of New Orleans at the time. So I've been interested then in how lots of projects can try to create connections between the will of the people and their instituted forms. And even when I think these are Occupy movements, Occupy images, when I think about so much of what was interesting about the Occupy movement, it was, of course, protest movements like this, but also the way that the Occupy also created its own new instituted forms. In, for instance, the human microphone, in daycares, in library systems created on site, in new systems for creating and preparing food and storing waste. So that relationship between how aesthetic acts of assembly and we could say political or even extra parliamentary governmental forms, how there could be a relationship has been of concern to me for quite a while, and now has activated also a recent book co-edited with two other colleagues about the relationship between arts and governance, where even governance becomes a kind of material for artists to rework and reimagine. All right, we're about time. I wanted to share this one example, and I'll describe very quickly Antonis Mokas, who from his perspective is a politician who began to use the arts in order to sensitize citizens in Bogota to instituted forms. At the time that Antonis took up the role of mayor in Bogota, the city of Bogota was understood to be almost ungovernable, whether that was rightly or wrongly attributed, where the issues of corruption and violence were legion, and where he began to try to create a locally ground-up movement for reconnecting citizens to citizenship, to the practice of citizenship. So he started to hire a lot of artists to help with the project. He did things like, he hired about 400 mimes to police traffic inside of the city where gridlock and where there had been a great deal of traffic accidents and even death. He hired mimes to direct traffic, to institute, to call attention every time somebody violated rules, and to use the sort of humor created as a way to, you could almost say, create a different kind of conversational space in order to think about what kind of collective behavior in the street fellow citizens wanted to commit to. So there's an intensely normative element in how he began to think about building a performative sense of citizenship from the ground up. He also passed out hundreds of thousands of cards like this, a thumbs up, thumbs down cards, where he would ask citizens to put up their thumbs down or thumbs up card every time they saw a fellow citizen doing something they liked or something that they didn't like. So somebody didn't help an older senior cross the street, they would get a thumbs down or thumbs up. And so it was attempting to resensitize fellow citizens to what kind of parameters and structures they wanted to agree to in order to sustain a civic life. All right, having thought a lot about that first association, I want to go to a second association around the word assembly, and that is to connect it to the arts, to think about the artistic modes of assembly. How we officially, we've already been talking about the art, but I also want to foreground that assembly or assemblage has a deep artistic history. Dubuffet used the term to expand the practice of collage into 3 dimensions, as did Rauschenberg's combines, which are often, of course, understood to be an extension of that practice. Others emphasize the term's kinship with practices of pastiche or appropriation. But within, say, the experimental history of performance, assemblage, assembly, environments, and happenings have all been part of a larger artistic movement that often sought to blur the boundaries between art and life, extending the time-space parameters from painting to sculpture to installation in space to then move in from 2, 3 to 4 dimensions, and finding new ways to fasten different kinds of miscellaneous parts into often quasi-theatrical experiments. So this genealogy is, of course, for me, a significant part of the genealogy that might then inform how we understand performance in the art world now, whether or not we understand how it activates and compels new understandings of what it means to gather, what it means to commit to time, place, and co-present gathering in space. I also think it's useful to think about that question next to a third association of this word assembly, the assembly line. A series of workers and machines in a factory by which a succession of identical items is progressively assembled. Here's an assembly line, which might not necessarily feel active as a line of thought today, but it does provide an excuse for me to connect the values of public assembly with a wider discourse on, you could say, now, the changing nature of work, how we think about work, and what the role of performance is in thinking about work now. Here we can linger on the assumed transition between the Fordist creation of items on the line and the post-Fordist production of services across lines of all kinds. Indeed, if we're to explore the contemporary relevance of the concept of assembly or reassembly now, it's hard not to focus on this presumed shift between Fordist and post-Fordist modes. As I and others have explored elsewhere, some argue that the performative turn in contemporary art now, the turn to performance or participation, discussed in our other strain, can be read as a symptom of a wider turn to service in late capitalism, in what Michael Hart, Negri, Paolo Verno, Maurizio Lazzarato, and many others have critiqued as our experience economy. Market exchange now takes place in an environment that sells ephemeral experiences, relational experiences, encounters, some of the other words that came up earlier, offering encounter and sociality as a kind of desirable project. So here are some of the central, so then it starts to become a question whether a world like this, of post-Fordist labor, is also animating an art world like this. So I'll think a tiny bit about, say, some of the central arguments that came forward in, say, the work of Paolo Verno, who is wondering whether this post-fordist turn is aligned fully with late capitalist service making, and or whether it is there is a possibility of mobilizing, of differently mobilizing this turn to, the supposed turn to immateriality in a post-fordist world. He, of course, is somebody who wants to say that there is a relationship between and a possibility for a different kind of political activation within this wider scene of encounter. So, for those of you who know or might know more about Verno's work, some of what's been interesting for me is to foreground how he takes forward what he calls the special capabilities of the performing artists in trying to think about service labor and think about how it might be differently mobilized. He remembers that the capabilities of the performing artist is particularly active because theirs is an activity which finds its own fulfillment, that is, its own purpose in itself. So one of the useful things about the history of the performing arts is that the product was never separable from the producer, and that performance is interesting and confounds certain theories around commodity formation because of that lack of separation, because the product is in the body of the performing artist. Secondly, he's also interested in performance, in the performing arts, because it is an activity that requires the presence of others. Audience, to remind us of one of the associations that came up earlier, that we can't have performance without audience, that the performing artist needs others. And also a third association, that it is about productively mobilizing the cognitive faculty. So he notes here that each of us has always been a virtuoso, a performing artist, at times mediocre and awkward, but in any event, a virtuoso. And I'll come back to that language of virtuosity in my conclusion. But I think what's important to take here is to find ourselves asking whether participatory art, with its emphasis on affect, encounter, and experience, is unwittingly providing an economic service, enabling an immaterial turn that now seems fully in consort with the latest experiential turns in late capitalism, or what we might do with this context toward activating a different performative theory of assembly. So on the one hand, we might say, are we breaking free of the assembly line, but also entering a new entrepreneurial zone? Or is there a contemporary art practices that might actually produce a different kind of internal resistance to this post-fordist shift? All right, so I'm going to think about that in my last moments before just noting another sense of assembly that's important, to me at least, the school assembly, which at least in English is often described as a general gathering of staff and pupils, but is for me interesting as we try to think about what it means to even activate the school, including this school, as a site of social transformation. So we can think too about what kinds of assembly in school, what forms of time, space, and manner at school are creating the conditions for active citizens. And also, at this time in higher education, certainly at my school, what it means to reassemble the school so that it is prime and adequate to the world that we have ahead of us. So, thinking about that, but jumping way immediately back to this effort at school, where in many ways I think of the site with which I opened as its own sort of experiment in education. I'm interested in trying to return here and join in my last moments a reflection about all of these different stakes, political and aesthetic and educational, to a final thought about, say, this word that is also comes up a great deal, virtuosity. It was a word that came up for Paolo Verno, and it's a word that is differently and interestingly fraught at this time. So I'll think about that right now. First of all, just to wake you up again, when you think about the word virtuosity, what do you think of?
Music.
Music. You think about music. It's so funny. Yeah, Paolo Verno is like, yes, the violin players, the singers, okay? Skill. That's about exceptional skill.
Expertise.
Expertise.
Technique.
Technique. A technical sense of expertise.
Perfection.
Training, practice. So in many ways, whether at the School of Music and Drama or at other places, whether at Valland, at Visual Art, that we can say that part of what the effort has always been is to create a context for cultivating exceptional skill, exceptional technical skill, and to some degree this word virtuosity might be more often associated with certain art forms rather than others. So this word virtuosity has been circulating actually a great deal in social theory as well as in aesthetic theory, and its renewed circulation, I think, can be confusing. It's not always clear why it's circulating. The lack of certainty, at least to me, bespeaks some conceptual confusion about what we mean by the term, but also sort of some provocative shifts and needs for expanded meaning. So I'm going to invoke two associations, one of which has already really come up in some of the things that you suggested. On the one hand, we might invoke an inherited traditional lay conception of virtuosity as exceptional skill, physical technique. This is the association heralded in art histories, musical histories, theater, dance, circus histories, where the practice practitioner awes and inspires with feats that are out of reach of the audience members who encounter them. Of course, this association of exceptional virtuosity is also the one roundly critiqued by generations of late 20th century artists who rejected the feats of their artistic forebears, saying no again and again to their spectacles, a la Yvonne Rainer. Next to that first association, celebrated skill and the sort of critique of that orientation, we also find this word virtuosity animating 21st century social theory, including the post-operaismo theories of, say, Paolo Verno that I invoked earlier. There you find Verno using the concept of virtuosity to galvanize his political analysis of labor. Virtuosity helps him, as well as critics like Hart, Negri, Corsani, and others, to theorize immaterial production. Again, they're using this term virtuoso as a way as something that coincides with their elaboration of the post-fordist turn to service, as well as what might be called their efforts to create a kind of counter-service or counter-staging for new models of mobilization. So what I'm trying to sort of ask is what happens when this inherited notion of virtuosity as exceptional skill coincides with, say, something like Paolo Verno's understanding of virtuosity in a post-fordist theoretical scene. I actually think it creates a strange tangle because the associations around those key words are different. So to help me actually think about this tangle, I'm going to share with you another tangle. This is one from the work of choreographer and performative artist, Faye Driscoll, a work called Thank You for Attending. The piece begins on a raised platform around which all audience members assemble, sitting with our shoes off, cross-legged on the floor. 5 bodies, propelled and propelling, suspend and suspending, compose a precious structure, a sentient collective form. If you're an audience member like me, you think you feel the vicarious connection to those connected to each other, and you think you feel that discomfort as bodies grow weary or bored of the obligation to hold up the limbs of another. As limbs release and torsos fall, dancers catch a different head or a different limb, propping and being propped by new extensions, releasing in boredom or excitement to new arrangements. Okay, so keep that in mind while we return once again to Verno, who sought to describe psychically and politically a turn toward emotional and affective labor. In trying to argue for the historical significance of that turn, once again, he is invoking, in finding food for thought in the special capabilities of the performance artist, for theirs is an activity that finds its own fulfillment and its own purpose in itself. It was this first quality, of course, that so intrigued and perplexed Karl Marx when he tried to define the labor for which the product is not separable from the act of producing. And it's the second association about the need for the presence of others that also underpinned Hannah Arendt's own prior theorization of the relationship between the performer and the political actor. Hannah Arendt once said, acting men, whether the politician or the performing artist, need the presence of others before whom they can appear. Both need a publicly organized space for their work. So, from the perspective of performance, there is a way that Verno is invoking some of the older associations of the performing arts and mining them in order to try to create a different kind of political mobilization. As I've argued elsewhere, performance sometimes seems to offer an arena of what might be called a proto-post-fordism. But in the meantime, I think that it's also interesting to recognize that for Verno, the association of virtuosity with these associations are quite different from the associations with virtuosity that some of you put forward when I asked you about your connections with the term. This idea about the entwinement of the product and process, this idea about the need for others, are interestingly most important for Verno, much more important than, say, the notion of virtuosity as a space of exceptional skill. Indeed, interestingly, virtuosity is a way of characterizing immaterial labor. It does not, and it actually in some ways sidelines the traditional notion of virtuosity as a place of exceptional skill. He says even here that you can be a virtuoso, at times mediocre and awkward, but in any event, a virtuoso. So virtuosity is now suddenly within reach of all of us. You can be a mediocre performer and still be a virtuoso. So these types of preoccupations, I think, are interestingly complex, but it puts us back into a certain set of questions about what it is to join two different genealogies of virtuosity into the same space. Once again, I think that Faye's work provides an interesting way for thinking about about what it might mean to join. As Thank You for Coming proceeds, the work of this choreographer travels across an occupied proscenium stage to occupy gallery spaces of different sorts. As it proceeds, and I'm about to finish. As it proceeds, the piece invokes and joyously starts to call out the names of everyone who attends. So they'll start to call out Ryan, Christina, Ingrid, and also in order to actually foreground the presence of others. And eventually they will come down off the stage and encourage all of us in the stage, all of us spectators, to take the stage apart, to put it together in new ways, to reassemble, and also actually even to start to hang on to different ropes hung across the stage, to venture actually quite awkwardly as quasi-circus of performers in reassembling and disassembling the stage. So for me, this is a piece that rethinks rather than fully rejects virtuosic spectacle, but it's also one that requires virtuosic skills, the core support of the dancer. There's a kind of gravitational defiance of gravity here that is also indebted to ballet, even as it also allows and invites all of us to be a part of the spectacle, however awkwardly. Offering us at the end, as we depart and make our way out, the dancers will give us our programs. They gave us our programs for the first time. They greet us by saying goodbye and remind us at that moment that the piece is called "Thank You for Coming." So offering us our welcome in reverse, the program reminds us of that title, "Thank You for Coming," in a conceptually rich, you could say, performance of service. The dancer's gesture enacts hospitality, "Thank you for coming," while making us question it, allowing us to thank these virtuosic dancers for being so good, exceptional at what they do, even as they assure us that their virtuosity is shared, that their virtuosity is matched by our own. Okay, thank you. Okay.
This great talk. We are actually completely out of time because other strands are continuing throughout the day. I'm going to let everyone go from here, but please join up with us in Glashuset and we'll continue the conversation there for those of you who are following the vocabulary strand today. So thank you again for coming, and thank you, Shannon.